It is a great honor for me to deliver a keynote address at this important hearing on racism, discrimination, Afrophobia, Xenophobia, focusing on the experience of people of African descent in the US. I wish to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this august event for allowing me to share some of the findings and recommendations of the working group on people of African descent following its visit to the United States of America in 2016. It is heartening that in the same year, the World Council of Churches, Racial Justice Accompaniment, visited the US as a continuation of the World Conference of Churches' long history of racial justice work. This has already been said by the previous speakers. Before talking about the mandate of the working group, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to share with you a Bible scripture which is relevant to the movement against racism, racial discrimination, Afrophobia, Xenophobia, and related intolerance. According to the NIV version of 1 John 2, verse 11, it reads, "But the one who hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he is going because the darkness has blinded his eyes." Ladies and gentlemen, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, Afrophobia, and related intolerance are signs of hatred. Wiping off these social ills can only be achieved through collaborative efforts. The involvement of the church, therefore, in these issues goes a long way in addressing these social ills. The working group of experts on people of African descent is mandated to study the problems of racial discrimination faced by people of African descent in the diaspora. To this end, the working group conducts official country visits to states. These visits provide an opportunity to examine in detail the situation of people of African descent in the country, to identify any problems and to make recommendations of how these could be resolved. By the nature of the mandate, the working group is required to look critically at the situation in a country and also to identify good practices that could be replicated in other countries. The visits are intended to provide an independent and impartial assessment, which will then be of use to all actors. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, in January 2016, the working group of experts on people of African descent visited the USA. This visit was a follow-up to an earlier visit by the working group, which took place in 2010. It is important to note that the working group's visit was at the invitation of the government of the United States. During this 2016 visit, we visited Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Jackson, Mississippi, Chicago, and New York City. At the end of the visit, we held a press conference and issued our preliminary conclusions and recommendations. We presented our report to the Human Rights Council in September 2016. The media statement and the final report are available on our website. In our report, we welcome the work of the civil rights centers in all government departments and the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission that implemented the civil rights legislation through investigation of complaints, litigation, issuance of guidance, and remedies, including compensation. We acknowledge the work of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division regarding access to justice, investigations and excessive use of force by police, and patterns of discrimination. We further welcome the steps taken by the government to reform the criminal justice system and combat racial discrimination and disparities. We further also welcome the abolition of the death penalty in 3 additional states since the working group visit to the US in 2010, as this form of inhuman punishment is disproportionately used against people of African descent, specifically the African Americans. One of the most important developments in the area of health at the time had been the adoption of the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act, which had allowed 2.3 million African American adults to gain medical health insurance. The US has a growing human rights movement which has successfully advocated for social change. Following the epidemic of racial violence by police, civil society networks calling for justice, together with other activists, are strongly advocating for legal and policy reforms and community control over policing and other areas which directly affect African American. Despite the positive measures outlined in the report, the working group of experts on people of African descent remains extremely concerned about the human rights situations of African Americans. In our report, we strongly condemn the continuing police killings and violence against African Americans, men, women, and children, including those of lesser-known cases, as well as those that have attracted media attention. The working group is convinced that the root cause of the problem lies in the serious lack of accountability for perpetrators of such killings despite the evidence. Specifically, we were deeply concerned about how the low number of cases where police officers have been held accountable. In its findings, the working group of experts identified the lack of initial investigations conducted by independent and external bodies, the wide discretion of the Attorney Generals to determine when and how to present charges, and the state and county laws that are not in line with the international standards on the use of force and firearms are some of the main barriers to police accountability. We therefore continue to urge government to take serious action to prevent any further killings as a matter of national priority. In line with our mandate, we recommended action to be taken by the US in addressing the challenges faced by African Americans. This includes improving the reporting of violations involving the excessive use of force and extrajudicial killings by the police, ensuring that reported cases of excessive use of force are independently investigated, that alleged perpetrators are prosecuted and punished with appropriate sanctions, and the victims of the families are provided with remedies. The working group called for the implementation of the recommendations in the final report of the President's Task Force on the 21st Century Policing. We recommended that the government steps up its efforts to prevent excessive use of force by law enforcement officials by ensuring compliance with the basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials and increased focus on conflict de-escalation rather than the use of force. Lest we forget the legacy of colonial history, enslavement and racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism and racial inequality in the US remained a serious challenge, as there had been no real commitment to reparations and to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent. Contemporary police killings and the trauma that they create are reminiscent of the past racial terror of lynching. Impunity for state violence resulted in the current human rights crisis and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Racial bias and disparities in the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, and the tough on crime policies disproportionately impact African Americans to this day. Mandatory minimum sentencing and disproportionate punishment of African Americans, including the death penalty, are of grave concern. State laws establishing mandatory minimum sentences and zero-tolerance policies have been applied with racial bias. The working group was also concerned at the use of police in schools and at school discipline being criminalized, subjecting African American children in particular to severe punishments. These practices are a violation of children's human rights and should be eliminated. The criminalization of poverty also disproportionately affects African Americans. As you all know, eradicating poverty in all its forms remain one of the greatest challenges facing humanity, and the US is no exception to this. The persistent gap in almost all human development indicators, such as life expectancy, income, wealth, level of education, and even food security between African Americans and the rest of the United States population reflects a level of structural and institutional discrimination that creates de facto barriers for people of African descent to fully exercise their human rights. During our visit, we were informed that across the country, there were police in schools arresting children for minor offenses. The police had authority to detain, frisk, and arrest children in school. Zero tolerance policies and heavy-handed efforts to increase security in schools led to the excessive penalization and harassment of African American children through racial profiling. This eventually leads children to be subjected to the juvenile and adult criminal justice systems. This phenomenon has been sadly described as the school-to-prison pipeline. In many cities, African Americans are facing a housing crisis in which people are not able to pay for their rents or mortgages, and even less to purchase a new house. In addition, the process of gentrification has a heavy impact on the African Americans who are being displaced from city centers under the argument of the need for new investment and development. According to the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, in 2015, of over 500,000 homeless people in the US, African Americans constituted 40.4%. They also constituted 30.4% of the homeless people that were unsheltered. African American communities were also calling for the environmental justice as they were disproportionately exposed to the environmental hazards impacting their health and standard of living. The highest pollution industrial facilities across a range of sectors, from farming, mining to manufacturing, are more likely to be situated in poor and minority neighborhoods, including those of people of African descent. For instance, we remain concerned about the health risk to people of African descent from the lead-contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. As the working group, we continue to follow the situation in the US and issue communications regarding human rights violations falling within our mandate, and also issue press releases. The working group is monitoring the situation and has repeatedly expressed its concern to the United States government about the police killings of African Americans and called for justice. Excessive use of force by the police against African Americans in the United States remain a regular occurrence. African Americans are reportedly shot at more than twice the rate of white people. The working group is convinced the root of the problem lies in the lack of accountability for perpetrators of such killings despite the evidence. The killings also demonstrate a high level of structural and institutional racism. In July 2016, following the deaths of Philando Castile in Minnesota and Alton Sterling in Louisiana at the hands of the police, the working group issued a press release. We strongly condemned the police killings and called for prompt, independent investigations to ensure that the perpetrators are prosecuted and punished. We called on the government to strongly assert the Black Lives Matter and prevent any further killings as a matter of national priority. Most recently, in July 2017, we issued a press statement together with other UN experts following the racial hatred displayed by the right-wing extremists, white supremacists, and neo-Nazis, Nazi groups in Charlottesville, Virginia. We view these events as the latest examples of increasing racism, racial discrimination, Afrophobia, racial violence, and xenophobia observed in the demonstrations across the US. Acts of hatred and racist hate speech must be unequivocally condemned. Hate crimes must be investigated and perpetrators must be prosecuted. We made an urgent, renewed call to the US authorities to step up its work to tackle the issue. We called upon the US government and state authorities to adopt effective policies as a matter of priority. The government must be vigilant in combating all acts of racism, xenophobia, racist violence wherever they occur. These incidents in California, Oregon, New Orleans, and Kentucky, as well as Charlottesville, demonstrate the geographical spread of the problem. The working group welcomes the cooperation and engagement with the international human rights system to combat racial discrimination. We hope that our report will support the government and all stakeholders in the process, and we express our willingness to assist in this important endeavor. The hearing on racism, discrimination, Afrophobia, and xenophobia, focusing on the experience of people of African descent in the US, could not have been better timed. We view conversations of this nature as complementing the mandate of the working group. We wish to take this opportunity to also encourage you to participate in the regional meetings for Europe, Central Asia, and North America on the International Decade for People of African Descent, which will be held in Geneva between the 23rd and 24th of November 2017. We look forward to hearing your voice, which is informed by biblical scriptures. As we conclude, I wish to refer to you once again to a scripture found in 1 John 2, verse 10, which reads as follows: anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. The world without racism, discrimination, xenophobia, Afrophobia, and related intolerance is what we all long for, where there is love, where people live in light, and where nothing in us will make us stumble. As we continue to do this work, as Apostle Paul wrote to the Ephesians in the book of Ephesians 6, verse 10, finally be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. I thank you for your attention.